Okay, now we're going to skip down on your notes. I want you to just skip down to your notes to number 6, where it talks about how a bill becomes a law in California. And we're going to talk about some of the differences between the federal government and the state government. And then next we're going to talk about some of the differences between the executive in California, the governor, and the president. The way that a bill becomes law in California is very similar to the way a bill becomes law at the federal level. So the process is more or less the same, going through the committees and going through that whole process. I'm trying to get my notes out. One of the differences is how they count a majority when they're voting. So in the state of California, when you're voting in the legislative branch, and again, the legislative branch in California, there's a lower house and an upper house. Do you guys remember? The lower house is called the state assembly. That's the lower house, and the upper house is the state senate. At the federal level, the lower house is the House of Representatives, and the upper chamber is the U.S. Senate. So we have an assembly and a senate. And just so you know, in the state assembly, there are 80 members of the state assembly in California, and then 40 members of the state senate. Right? So 80 members in the state assembly, 40 members in the state senate, and you already know we have 435 members of the House of Representatives and 100 in the Senate. When they're voting in the legislative branch in California, passage requires a majority of the total membership of the body. So if you're trying to pass something in the state assembly, you have to get a majority of the 80%. Doesn't matter if there's only 62 people there, you need to get a majority of the membership. Does that make sense? So if you need 41 votes to pass something in the assembly, you're going to need 21 votes in the Senate, because they're going to count how many votes did you get and how many people could have voted. So they're going to count everybody. In Congress, it requires passage of a majority of the people voting. So we talked about how a bill in the Senate requires a simple majority. Well, if you needed a simple majority of the membership, every bill would require at least 51 votes. But if only 97 people vote, then you just need a majority of the 97 who are voting. Okay, so that's what I mean by California passage requires a majority of the total membership. In Congress, at the federal level, it requires a majority of those who are voting to do that. Now, that's not true in every case. There are some things where you need the actual number, but for the most part, this is true. Also, when a bill becomes a law in California, for a law to go into effect immediately in the state of California, for it to go into effect immediately, it has to contain an urgency clause. So if they pass a law and it has this urgency clause, it can go into effect immediately, but it requires a 2/3 majority of the membership to pass that. So when they pass something and they say this is going to go into effect immediately, to get it to go into effect immediately requires even a larger threshold. In Congress, there's no such requirement. They can just say it passes by the simple majority, and they can say it's going to start as of the time that it's passed, or they can say it's going to start January 1st of next year. They can go ahead and do it however they want. Yeah, Nick.
So without the urgency, they only need a simple majority of the total membership.
Right.
And then with that urgency clause, they have to have a 2/3 vote.
Right.
Is that correct?
Exactly. Or it would go into effect the next year. So it would go into effect on January 1st of the following year.
So if they got less than 2/3, then it could
Correct.
still go into effect, but not as quickly.
But it wouldn't. They couldn't get it to go into effect immediately.
Just backtracking a little, how many people are in the upper house state senate?
In the upper house and the state senate, there are 40 people, 40 representatives. In the lower house, there are 80. So different ways in which bills become laws in California versus the federal level. Now, next I want to talk about the role of the executive in the legislative process. Because one of the things that the governor has that the president does not have is a line item veto. Now, we talked about the line item veto a couple weeks ago, and so hopefully you guys remember what I'm talking about. A line item veto is the idea that the president can go ahead and he can sign a bill into law, but he can pick out individual items in that law and veto them and still sign the rest of the law. So the governor can go ahead and eliminate spending items. Let's say the legislature passes a big spending bill, and the governor thinks that some of the things in that spending bill are a waste of money. He can just go ahead and say no, 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 and no, and he can veto them. Now the legislature can override that veto with a 2/3 majority, but the governor can pick and choose. What the governor can also do is just reduce the amount of money. So if they pass a law that says we're going to spend $100 million on that, the governor can say, oh no, it's going to be $50 million, and he can sign that into law. Now again, they can override that, but the governor can do it on his own, by himself, line item veto. And a lot of governors, by the way, a lot of governors have this authority because it's a way to keep spending down. Go ahead.
This isn't for like a federal law that's passed?
Right. This is all state law. Everything that I'm talking about as far as this California government is just the California government. Right? At the federal level, we know that the president doesn't have a line item veto. If he gets a bill that spends a bunch of money, and let's say he thinks 80% of it is good and 20% of it is stupid, can he just go ahead and veto the 20%? No. He's just got to either sign the whole thing into law or veto it. Right? Governors, or the governor of California, can go ahead and do that. Okay? So the governor has a line item veto. So if I ask a question about what's the difference between what powers do governors have that presidents don't, right? This is one of the things that I would be talking about, the ability to issue a line item veto. Then in terms of the executive themselves, the governors serve for 4-year terms, just like presidents. They can serve for 4 years. But just like presidents, they can only run for 2 times. Once they run for 2 times and they win twice, then they're done. They cannot run again. So we have term limits at the federal level. For the president, we also have term limits at the local level. So if I ask you what are some of the similarities between the executive at the federal level and at the local level, at the state level, you could talk about the idea that they go ahead and they serve, both have serve 4-year terms and have 2-year term limits. Like the president as well, the governor has power when it comes to setting the budget. What the governor does is he proposes a budget and says, here's what I think we should do for the next fiscal year. And then he gives it to the legislative branch and they can modify his proposal. That's exactly what happens at the US level too. The president proposes a budget and then Congress goes ahead and modifies it. Oftentimes they just scrap it entirely and do their own thing. But again, the governor has a line item veto. The president does not. In terms of this veto power, the governor can veto legislation passed by the Assembly and the Senate, and can veto, like I said, items that are in the legislation. A 2/3 majority can go ahead and override a governor's veto. So they can override a veto, but governors can do line item vetoes. Another power that the governor has is the power of appointments. They can go ahead and appoint many offices. Now there are some other executives that are elected at the state level. The governor gets to appoint some things, but the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, the insurance commissioner, these are all offices in California that are elected. So the governor doesn't get to appoint these people. But there are a number of other offices that are appointed by the governor and that have to be approved by the state legislature. Oh, and then scroll down. Oh, that's what I was just talking about. There are numerous high offices appointed by the governor, but subject to the confirmation of the legislative branch. Just the same way the president can nominate people and they have to get the approval of the legislature. But in this case, who approves at the federal level? A nomination. Does the legislature do it as a whole?
Senate.
The Senate. Okay. Is that the end? And that's the end. California government in 40 seconds and 20 tries. Later.